The first $100,000 will feel like nothing happened. Not nothing exciting, nothing at all. You'll check the number on a random Tuesday, sitting on a couch, half paying attention to something else, and there it will be. Six figures, and you will feel absolutely no different than you felt 40 seconds earlier when you didn't have it. This is the part nobody warns you about, because it contradicts everything the internet has told you to expect. Every finance creator, every book, every motivational quote, graphic promises that this number is the turning point, the moment things click, the moment you finally feel like an adult with money. None of that happens. And the gap between what you were promised and what actually occurs when you cross this line is so specific, so consistent, and so rarely discussed that by the end of this video, you'll understand your own first 100,000, whether it's behind you, ahead of you, or happening right now, in a completely different way. 5 real, uncomfortable, occasionally funny truths that explain why this milestone feels so different from what you were promised, why it matters more than every milestone after it, and why the version of you who crosses it will be fundamentally more equipped to handle the version who crosses the second 100,000 and the million after that. If you already have your first 100, this will explain feelings you've had but never articulated. If you're still building toward it, this will save you from a specific kind of disappointment that catches almost everyone off guard. Let's start with the thing that surprises people most. One thing. It doesn't feel like anything. And that's actually the point. Here's what you were promised somewhere along the way, by 100 different sources you can't even name individually anymore. You were promised that hitting 6 figures would feel like arrival, a door opening, confetti, metaphorically speaking. Some internal shift where suddenly you'd feel like a person who has money instead of a person who's building toward having money. Here's what actually happens. You're doing laundry, or you're at a red light, or you're half listening to a podcast, and you glance at an app, and the number that used to start with a 9 now starts with a 1 followed by 5 zeros, and you feel basically nothing. Maybe a small flicker of satisfaction, gone within seconds, replaced immediately by whatever you were thinking about before you checked. This isn't a personal failure. It isn't evidence that you're somehow bad at appreciating your own progress. It's structural. Your brain evaluates progress relative to a baseline, and your baseline moved gradually, dollar by dollar, over months or years, exactly the way your weight moves if you're losing it slowly instead of all at once. Nobody feels the 10th pound differently than the 9th. The scale just says a different number. The 100,000 didn't arrive as an event. It arrived as an accumulation, one paycheck, one automated transfer, one skipped upgrade at a time, and accumulations don't register emotionally the way events do. This matters because if you're currently building toward this number, expecting an emotional payoff at the finish line, you need to recalibrate that expectation right now before you get there, so you're not blindsided by the anticlimax the way almost everyone before you has been. The actual payoff isn't a feeling, it's a capability. Somewhere around this number, math starts behaving differently. Compound growth on 6 figures produces more raw dollars annually than compound growth on smaller amounts, even at identical percentage returns. The number stops feeling special and starts becoming mechanically useful, which is a much better outcome than feeling special, even though nobody advertises it that way. You won't feel richer. You'll simply, slowly, start being richer in ways that compound quietly in the background. Second thing, the people around you. Notice before you do, and they react in ways you won't expect. Here's something that catches almost everyone off guard, and it has nothing to do with money directly. Somewhere during the process of building your first 100,000, your relationship with spending changes in small, visible ways, and the people closest to you notice these changes long before you consciously register that anything's different. You stop suggesting the expensive restaurant. You start asking out loud whether something is actually worth the money before buying it, a habit you didn't have 5 years earlier. You decline a trip not because you can't afford it, but because you've started running a mental cost-benefit calculation you never used to run. And this particular trip doesn't clear the bar. None of this feels like a big deal from the inside. It feels like ordinary decision-making, but the people around you experience it differently. Some friends interpret this as you becoming cheap, and they'll say so. Sometimes directly, sometimes through comments that sound like jokes but land with an edge. Other friends interpret it as you becoming boring, no longer spontaneous, calculating everything instead of living freely. A smaller number of people, usually the ones who are quietly building something similar themselves, recognize exactly what's happening and respect it without needing an explanation. Here's the part nobody prepares you for. You'll feel a specific low-grade guilt during this entire phase because you'll suspect, correctly, that some of these friendships were partially built around a shared spending pattern that no longer exists. And ending a spending pattern feels uncomfortably like ending part of a friendship, even when the friendship itself is completely fine. You didn't do anything wrong. You just quietly opted out of a shared behavior that used to bind a group together, and the group notices the gap before anyone names it directly. This phase passes. Most friendships adjust or naturally reorganize around new shared activities. But while you're inside this transition, expect a specific kind of social friction that nobody warns you about in advance, and expect it to feel worse than it actually is, because you're experiencing it for the first time with no context for how temporary it usually turns out to be. Third thing, you'll develop an entirely new relationship with losing money, and it won't look like what you expected. Before your first 100,000, losing money feels catastrophic because losses are measured against a small base. And small bases make percentage losses feel enormous even when the actual dollar amount is trivial. After your first 100,000, something strange happens. A single bad month in the market can erase more dollars than your entire starting salary from several years earlier, and you'll expect this to feel devastating. It usually doesn't. Not because you've become numb and not because you don't care about money anymore. Because somewhere in the process of building this amount, you developed an actual understanding of volatility instead of just an abstract fear of it. You watched the number go up. You watched it dip. You watched it recover. You did this enough times that the dip stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like weather, an expected cyclical condition of the environment you're operating in, rather than a personal crisis requiring immediate action. This is the single most underrated benefit of building your first 100,000 slowly instead of quickly. People who receive $100,000 suddenly through an inheritance, a settlement, or a lucky break frequently panic during the first real downturn because they never built the emotional callus that comes from watching the number move naturally over time. People who build it gradually develop something closer to muscle memory. The dip happens. You've seen this before, not intellectually but somatically, that it recovers, because you've lived through smaller versions of the exact same pattern a dozen times already at lower dollar amounts. This is also the point where you'll notice something slightly uncomfortable about yourself. The same percentage loss that would have caused you real anxiety 2 years earlier now barely registers, and you might briefly wonder if something is wrong with you for caring less. Nothing is wrong with you. You've simply built the specific kind of experience that no amount of reading about investing can substitute for, and this experience becomes one of the most valuable assets in your entire financial life, even though it never shows up on any balance sheet. Fourth thing, the math becomes genuinely boring. And boring is the entire goal, even though nobody tells you that in advance. Somewhere around your first 100,000, if you've been doing this correctly, your financial life becomes almost aggressively uninteresting. The same amount transfers automatically every month. The same funds, the same allocation, the same unremarkable, repetitive process that produced this number in the first place continues producing results with no need for your ongoing attention or emotional investment. This catches people off guard because the entire cultural narrative around building wealth is built on excitement. Stock picks, timing the market, finding the next big thing. Every piece of financial media you've ever consumed implicitly promises that wealth building is supposed to feel engaging. Building your first 100,000 the reliable way feels like the opposite of engaging. It feels like watching a very slow pot of water that you're told will eventually boil, except you can't actually see it boiling. You just have to trust the process based on faith and a general understanding of thermodynamics. This boredom is not a bug. It is, in fact, the single strongest predictor of whether someone successfully reaches this milestone at all, because the people who treat their first 100,000 as an exciting project, constantly adjusting, constantly chasing something more interesting than the boring, reliable path, are disproportionately the same people who never actually arrive. The people who get bored on purpose, who choose the unremarkable path deliberately and then genuinely stick with the boredom for years without needing it to feel exciting, are the ones who look up one day and discover the number quietly crossed 6 figures while they weren't paying particularly close attention. Boring in this specific context isn't the absence of a good strategy. Boring is the strategy. And nobody tells you this in advance because boring doesn't make a compelling headline, doesn't sell a course, and doesn't generate the kind of excitement that keeps people subscribed to financial content promising the next exciting thing. Fifth thing, crossing this number reveals what you actually value, sometimes in ways you didn't expect and occasionally don't like. This is the thing that catches the most people off guard because it isn't really about money at all. Somewhere after your first 100,000, you'll find yourself with actual optionality for the first time in your adult life. Not enough to quit your job, not enough to buy a house outright, but enough that certain decisions which used to be dictated entirely by financial necessity now have a small amount of genuine choice built into them. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because that choice reveals something about your actual priorities that abstract financial planning never forced you to confront. Some people discover at this stage that they genuinely want more freedom immediately, even at the cost of slower future growth, and they make decisions accordingly. Cutting hours, taking a lower paying job with better flexibility, prioritizing time over further accumulation. Other people discover the opposite, that having a taste of real financial progress made them hungrier, not more satisfied, and they find themselves pushing harder toward the next milestone instead of relaxing into the first one. A third group discovers something they didn't expect at all, that the money itself was never really the point, and the actual satisfaction came from the discipline and the process. And now that the first concrete proof of that discipline exists in the form of an actual number, they feel a strange kind of anticlimax because the identity of person who is building towards something was more satisfying than the identity of person who has built something. None of these reactions is wrong, but almost nobody expects to learn something this specific and this personal from a number in a bank account, and this is exactly why so few people talk about it honestly. It's much easier to talk about percentages and allocations than to admit that a spreadsheet accidentally revealed something uncomfortable about what you actually want from your life. Here's what connects all five of these things, and it's the part that actually matters more than any individual point on this list. The first $100,000 isn't valuable because of what it buys. At this stage, it typically can't buy financial independence, can't replace a salary, can't fundamentally change your day-to-day life in any dramatic material way. It's valuable because of what it proves, and what it builds inside you that no amount of money handed to you all at once could ever replicate. It proves that the boring, repetitive, unglamorous process actually works over a long enough timeline, even when it doesn't feel like it's working in the moment. It builds an emotional tolerance for volatility that becomes the single most important psychological asset for every dollar that comes after this one. It reorganizes your relationships in small ways that reveal who was actually aligned with where you were heading versus who was simply along for a particular phase. And it forces a confrontation with your actual values that no amount of financial theory could have produced in the abstract, because theory doesn't create real choices, and real choices are the only thing that reveals what you genuinely want. The first 100,000 is a training program disguised as a number. Everyone focuses on the number. Almost nobody talks about the training. Here's the honest part. The part that might sting a little if you're currently in the middle of building toward this milestone. If you're waiting for this number to feel like something, to produce a clear emotional signal that you've made it, that signal is probably not coming, at least not in the form you've been picturing. The anticlimax is normal. It happens to almost everyone. And the fact that it happened to you isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong or that you're somehow bad at appreciating your own success. It's a sign that gradual accumulation simply doesn't register the same way sudden events do, and no amount of positive thinking changes basic human psychology. What you can do, instead of waiting for a feeling that may never arrive, is start paying attention to the actual changes happening beneath the surface. The new comfort with volatility. The new instinct to ask whether something is worth it before buying it. The friendships quietly reorganizing around genuine alignment instead of shared spending habits. The small, real choices revealing what you actually want from your life, whether that's more freedom, more ambition, or simply confirmation that the process itself was always the real reward. These are the actual milestones. The number is just where you happen to notice them all arriving at once. You'll cross your first $100,000 on an ordinary day, doing something completely unrelated to money, and you'll feel almost nothing, and that nothing is not a failure. It's proof that you built something the right way, slowly enough that your entire nervous system had time to adjust alongside your bank account, instead of being shocked by a number that arrived faster than your emotional infrastructure could process it. The friends who drifted during this process were never really about the money to begin with, and the ones who stayed, or the new ones who arrived, understand something about you that the old spending patterns never could have revealed. The volatility that used to terrify you now barely registers. And that specific hard won calm is worth more than the number itself, because it's the thing that lets you keep building through every dip that comes after this one. And somewhere in the middle of all this quiet, unremarkable accumulation, you learned something about what you actually want, which is worth more than any amount of money could ever be worth on its own. The first 100,000 doesn't feel like arrival. It feels like nothing at all. And now you finally understand why that nothing was always the entire point.